this is an important week for many of us. Some of us maybe are not in this rhythm anymore, but school does start back this week, which makes some of us, especially maybe the teachers over in this area, I'm not going to look at right now, want to cry. And for some of the others of us want to cheer. I will say for me and my house, we are pretty excited about school starting back. We need a schedule. But that doesn't mean that we haven't had a great summer. We've gotten to spend a lot of amazing time with family and friends. We've swam for hours on end. We got to go watch a WNBA game up in Indianapolis. Got to see Caitlin Clark get her first triple-double, if you're a fan. That was fun. That's my personal favorite. But when it comes to my children, none of those things are kind of like the peak of their summer, because right now in their young little lives, nothing excites them more than getting to go to the fine dining establishment that is Carrabba's. You might think, oh, that's sweet. They must really like Italian. No, not really. They don't actually eat their meals. They're there for the bread. It's gotten to such a point that before we go in, Jeremy has to coach them. He has to say, listen, we're only getting 3 baskets of bread. That's it. Pace yourselves. So like they start digging in, there's that dipping sauce that's got the, olive oil and the delicious herbs in it. And I'm pretty sure if they brought that out in a jug, that our son Sam would just chug it, okay? But I feel very self-conscious the entire time we're sitting there and they're attacking this bread, because I always feel like people around us have to be noticing this happening and are probably thinking to themselves like they must never feed their children. But, at the same time, I get it. Like, what's not to love? Bread is like the greatest thing since, itself, right? Like sliced bread. It's wonderful. Pleasure in life that can be enjoyed in its most basic form, like straight out of the oven with a little bit of butter or maybe like strawberry jam. If anybody would like to bring some of that over the next month while we're talking about the bread of life, that's on point. But it can also be dressed up, right? You can add a little sugar to it and suddenly you have cinnamon rolls. Oh man. Or if you like savory stuff, you can put some meat between 2 slices. Suddenly you got a sandwich. Or you can put some tomato sauce on top with some cheese and heat it up, and you get a little slice of heaven right here on earth. Clearly, bread was one of God's very good gifts to us. It sustains us. It fills us up. It gives us the nourishment that we need to live. However, it also brings us together as people, doesn't it? Across all of time and across all cultures, when people have sat down for a meal, bread is usually right there at the center of it. Bread is made to be shared with others, unless you're my kids at Carrabba's. It's made to be shared with others. And so community is formed when we break bread together. And so in both of these ways, in sustaining us and binding us together, bread is central to our lives as humans. And so maybe that's why in the book of John, when Jesus is telling us more and more about who he is, using these I am statements, the very first one that he uses is, I am the bread of life. Perhaps this is, clearly something that he knew we would all understand, something that all of us have experienced and tasted. He knew this was something that could help us grasp something of who he is. And so over the next 4 weeks, we're going to really be breaking this down. What does it mean when Jesus said that I am the bread of life? But today, before we really dig in, we need to really look at the story that comes before it, the story that kind of prompts Jesus saying this in the first place. We're going to be looking at it in the Gospel of John, which has some interesting details that the other Gospels don't have in it. But did you all know that this miracle that we're going to look at today that sets this up is the only miracle that shows up in all 4 Gospels? Does anybody know what the miracle is? You heard it earlier. Feeding the multitude, right? 5 loaves and 2 fish. So this is how it all starts. Jesus has crossed the Sea of Galilee. He's been ministering up on the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, around Capernaum, which was kind of like his home base throughout his ministry. And he's gotten a little popular. People are following him around all over the place. He's teaching, he's healing folks. And so maybe, just maybe, he decides to cross over to, scholars think, like the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. Maybe he did that just to get a little privacy, right? To get a little recharge. Parents, you know how this goes. You go to the bathroom and lock yourself in sometimes to try to get that distance, right? Your kids find you, but you try. And so maybe that's what Jesus was doing. Or what we know about that area where they think Jesus went was that this was actually Gentile territory. And so maybe Jesus decided to go to this new area so that he could share the good news of his coming kingdom with a new group of people. But regardless, why ever Jesus decided to cross the Sea of Galilee, it really doesn't matter, because guess what? It doesn't work. His plan doesn't get to be followed through on, because when he crosses over, all those people from up in Capernaum area, they jump in their boats and they follow him right on across the sea. It kind of makes me think about the poor athletes at the Olympics right now. Who's been watching the Olympics? All right, good. Somebody tell me your highlight of the Olympics so far. Anybody? Simone? Katie Ledecky? Anything else? It's all about Simone and Katie. I love it. Yeah. For me, I told y'all last week I was all about the women's rugby this year. Got to watch them win bronze this past week. And anything that Snoop Dogg's at, like him, Snoop Dogg commentating badminton, I mean, it's pretty good. Best commentator I've heard on it. But like some of you have already said, for me, watching Simone was a big moment. In fact, I got so excited about it, I didn't want to miss the team final on, Tuesday. So on Monday night, I texted the host staff, and I'm like, I'm putting it on the big screen in the cup. Bring your laptop, bring your food. We're watching it. And so we're all sitting there watching the team final. And of course, Simone is warming up for the floor exercise. And all of a sudden, it appears that she is hurt, right? It is a very tense moment for us. I'm sure it was for her too, but it definitely was for us as we watched her kind of like walking around. I'm sure she's sitting there in pain. She's probably afraid she's not going to be able to compete. But the whole time, she has no privacy, right? Look at all the cameras zooming in while she's trying to figure out what's going on. And what you can't see is on this side of it, there are cameras that are this far away from her. And you could watch her try to turn and get away from them, and there's just another camera right in her face. And so I say all that to say this. At this point in Jesus' ministry, he was Simone Biles level of popular, okay? Every single move of his was being followed. Thus, the people follow him across the sea. Now, the next two verses in John chapter 6, they kind of sound like throwaway verses, they're just fluff, they're just filler that's there. We kind of race through them to get on to the good stuff, the miracle. However, these next two verses are actually very important because they help us more fully understand everything that follows. This is what John says. Then Jesus went up on a what? Mountainside, and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. So Jesus sits down on a mountainside, and it's Passover time. Who cares, right? Big deal. Why is this even in there? Well, for us, it doesn't mean a lot. But for the Jewish people who would have first been reading this would have been a big hint. For all my Taylor Swift fans out here, this was an Easter egg, okay? This is us getting this hint about what this is all about. Callie's out there here I am, I'm one of the fans. So when they were reading a mountain and Passover time, it brings to mind one person and one person alone, one of the greatest leaders of their faith. Instantly, they're going to think about Moses. Right? Moses, who encountered God on a mountain and who liberated God's people from Egypt, which is what Passover is all Another prophet had actually been promised to Moses when Moses was still alive. God had promised Moses in Deuteronomy 18 that I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. And so, again, when people are first reading or hearing this, the Jewish people taking this in would have kind of like set up on the edge of their seats. They would have become more alert. They're like, is this a hint about who Jesus truly is? Could it possibly be that this long-awaited prophet like Moses has finally arrived into our world? And so, again, their attention is at a high level as they start to read on. And at this point, we remember that Jesus is not alone there, right? This huge crowd has followed him across the sea. And guess what happens? Something that happens to all of us. They are hungry. But the problem is they can't run back home and eat, right? They've just come across the sea. And there's not a Pizza Hut to dial in and get delivery. There's no McDonald's to go around the drive-thru. And Jesus, of course, was full of wisdom, and so he knew all the way back then what Snickers has taught us now. You're not you when you're hungry, right? I'm not me when I'm hungry. Just ask Jeremy, right? And so Jesus knew, like, a crowd full of hangry people, like, that is something to be alarmed about. We need to do something here. And so he says to his disciple Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Now, Jesus, he already had a plan in mind. But the text says that he wanted to test Philip. I have a feeling that Jesus was kind of trying to see where Philip was in this moment of understanding who he was. Philip's been following him around. He's seen Jesus perform all of these miracles before they've crossed over the sea, and now they have this situation before them, and Jesus wants to see if Philip really gets like what Jesus could do in this situation. However, we quickly realize that Philip immediately looks at this situation not through the lens of all that Jesus has done, who he's shown himself to be, but instead through his very limited human perspective. He gets very practical in this moment, and all he sees is an unsolvable problem, a task that just cannot possibly be completed. And so he responds to Jesus, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. It's a little dramatic, but it makes the point, right? Like, we couldn't possibly feed these people. However, there's another one of Jesus' disciples that's lingering nearby. His name is Andrew. He often gets overshadowed by his brother, Simon Peter, who we hear a lot about. But Andrew's been following Jesus around as well. And when he sees this situation, he doesn't look at it through that same perspective as Philip. No, he has this glimmer of hope. And so he speaks up to Jesus and he says, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. But how far will they go among so many? Like, he clearly sees the challenge of the situation. Like, how far will this go? But despite that, he takes these 5 small loaves and these 2 fish and he puts them in the hands of Jesus. It seems that he has this inkling. It seems that Andrew already has a bit of insight that other people, even other disciples of Jesus like Philip, are still catching up to. He seems to get that while 5 small loaves and 2 fish in his hands are just a kid's sack lunch, that in the hands of Jesus, the possibilities are endless. Because maybe, just maybe, this guy really is that prophet. The prophet like Moses that they've all been waiting for. I love that Jesus doesn't really answer Andrew's question that's still hanging there in the air, the question of, but how far will they go with so many? Instead, it's as if Jesus like winks at Andrew and says, watch this. I'll show you how far they can go. And he has the crowd sit down, all 5,000 men plus women and children. So we have no idea how large this crowd actually was. But what we do know is that Jesus takes one of those small 5 loaves and he gives thanks to the Father, And then he starts to distribute it and distributes it some more and distributes it some more and some more and some more. And then he does the same thing with the 2 fish. Remember, Philip's reaction is like, we can't even give these people a bite if we had half a year's wages, right? But the people ate, and they ate, and they ate until they were full. And the kind of feeling that we're going for here, that it's the kind of full we feel on Thanksgiving, right? The kind of full when we have to like get up from the table and loosen our belts a little bit if we weren't wise enough to wear our stretchy pants in the first place. You know, the crowd's hunger has not just been satisfied, like they are stuffed to the point that they can't take another bite, and that there are 12 basketfuls of bread left over. Jesus has miraculously fed these people out in the middle of nowhere. And guess who had done something very similar? The prophet Moses. Through the prophet Moses, God had fed the Israelites who were hungry, out wandering in the wilderness in the middle of nowhere. I got to see the wilderness in person for the first time last fall. And once I saw it, I kind of understood why they might need a little help from God to sustain themselves, right? There's a whole lot of sand. There's a whole lot of rocks, not a lot to eat there. And so as the people had just escaped slavery in Egypt, they get out there, they get a little hangry, at which time we all know our sense of reason goes out the window, right? And so they start to grumble and say, let's just go back. It's better to be slaves in Egypt where we had stuff to eat. But God heard their cries, and he said this to Moses. He says, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. And so sure enough, starting the next day, after the dew had kind of gone on the ground, there would appear this flaky-like substance that was bread from heaven, manna, that the people could go out and gather, and they could gather as much as they needed for that day. They were never in want. There's been a lot of speculation about what this bread of heaven tasted like. You know, there's not any out there for us to sample today. There's no recipe for us to try to make it, right? But I have my own opinion about what it tastes like. This is not a scholarly opinion at all. It's based purely on experience. But this past fall, like I said, we were there. And you might remember the story. A little war broke out. We had to get out of Israel. And so we got up really early one morning. And we started in Jerusalem. And we were on our way to Amman, Jordan. It ended up being an 11-hour journey. It probably should have been about 3. But lots of people were trying to do the same thing. So we got over to the Jordan side, and we're waiting to go through customs with lots and lots of other people. And we're just having to sit there. And the problem was we had no food to eat. We found ourselves in a very similar situation to the Israelites. Here we are in the middle of nowhere, no food to eat. When all of a sudden, it was as if manna from heaven appeared. Unbeknownst to me, my father, on the Israel side, before we crossed over, had bought the biggest bag of peanut M&Ms that I have ever seen. And so he pulls them out of his bag, and he starts letting us have some. And then it was like bread and fishes, because like all these other people were coming under like the pavilion area where we were sitting. He didn't care who they were. He started just giving them out to everybody. And it was like there kept being more and more peanut M&Ms in the bag. I was watching this like, come on, Dad, you got to take care of us first. Don't give them all away. But he distributed them, and he had that bag. It just like kept giving. Even when we got back on the bus to finish our long journey, there was still enough peanut M&Ms to pass around, and we all ate them all the way there. That was the only food I had. I think they finally found some other food, but I lived off the M&Ms. But so, in my humble opinion, man, I must have tasted something like peanut M&Ms, because that is how God provided for us in the wilderness. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. But this miracle, this sign of Jesus miraculously feeding this multitude out in the middle of nowhere, it caused something to click in people's brains. If they had missed the hint, if they had missed the Easter egg of Jesus sitting on a mountain at Passover time, whenever Jesus feeds this multitude, people finally get it. John says, after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. They got it. But very quickly, we see that they are still looking at Jesus through that very limited, practical, human perspective, kind of like our friend Philip earlier, right? Moses had led God's people out of oppression in Egypt. And so instantly these people, they think that Jesus is there to lead them out of their oppression that they're experiencing under the rule of Rome. They assume that Jesus has come to become king, to sit on a throne. But John says, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Jesus had come not just to be an earthly king that would lead Israel to freedom once more. No, he had come to be a heavenly king, to bring liberation to the whole world all at once. When Jesus had fed the people in the middle of nowhere, just like Moses, he had done this in a way that pointed both backward and forward. As he took the bread and he gave thanks to the Father, it indeed did point back to that very first Passover, when the people of Israel, they sat down and they enjoyed a meal together, part of which was unleavened bread. And then they prepared for God to pass over their houses, to give them safety before they were led out to freedom. Since that first Passover, the Jewish people had always remembered that day, and they'd held a festival where they ate that very same meal. And the point of that meal was not just to remember what God had done for them in the past, but as they ate that meal together, as they tasted that unleavened bread, it was supposed to be as if they were re-experiencing those events for themselves. The point of the meal was so that at the end of the meal, all of them would feel as if they themselves had come out of oppression in Egypt. And so Jesus, when he gave thanks and he distributed the bread to the multitude, when it was Passover time, it indeed pointed back to those events. But what the people sitting there that day could have not foreseen, what they could not have grasped, what they could not have begun to understand was how what Jesus was doing in that moment pointed forward as well. We know from the other Gospels that on the night before Jesus gave himself up for us, he sat down and he enjoyed the Passover meal with his disciples. And as a part of that meal, he took that bread and he gave thanks to the Father and he gave it to his disciples saying, "Take, eat, do this in remembrance of me." He was pointing forward to the liberation that he was about to bring to every single person on the planet. Not just from slavery, from some physical entity like Egypt, but from sin and from death and from every form of brokenness, so that we can experience abundant freedom here and now and forevermore. And so as we prepare to come to the table today, let me ask you, what is it that you need liberation from? You know, last week we talked about forgiveness. Maybe you need liberation from some sort of bitterness that you're carrying around. Perhaps there's some burden that you've been trying to carry all by yourself and you are exhausted because it was never meant to be carried all alone. Maybe you are in some sort of situation where you feel like you have this need for control. Or maybe you're living in this reality where you're trying to keep everyone around you happy all the time. The list is just endless, right? It's endless of the things that hold us captive. But perhaps you've been looking at that situation, whatever it is, like our friend Philip. Our friend Philip, you know, who looked at it and said, "This is impossible. I'm not even going to try," right? There's no way to overcome it, and so you just decide there's no solution. But today I want to challenge you to take that situation and to place it in the hands of the one who is far, far greater than the prophet Moses, who's come to liberate us from everything that holds us captive. I want to invite you to take the perspective of Andrew in this situation. And I really love this about Andrew because Andrew is not 100% certain, right? Andrew still has questions. Andrew's still trying to figure it out. Yet somehow he's able to rustle up just enough hope, just enough faith to place what he has in the hands of Jesus. And so, what would that look like for you? What would it look like to hand over whatever that situation is that you're carrying around and just seeing what it is that Jesus can do with it. I told the first service, I hadn't planned to tell this story today, but I felt like I should, so I'm going to tell you all too. But there's been a situation in my family for over 20 years in which, in my extended family, there was one member of our family that just kind of broke away, that withdrew. There was all kinds of hurt and brokenness. We didn't really understand why or what was happening. We'd always been such a tight family, so it's been incredibly painful. And over that 20 years, almost every person in our family has just given up on that person. There's a whole lot of bitterness. There's just a whole lot of anger that exists in our family over the situation. But over time, like I said, people just said, it's impossible. Very much the perspective of Philip, like, this isn't changing. We're not wasting any time on it. We're done. Almost every person except for one, and that was my dad. And my dad was held captive all these years by just like the sense of grief. My dad very much likes oneness and harmony, and so he just could not. He could not get over it. He would not move to bitterness. He would not give up to this person, though. He kept taking the situation and putting it in the hands of Jesus again and again and again. Sometimes very hurtful things happen, but instead of giving up in the hurt, he'd hand it over to Jesus again. And over the past 3 months, I have watched a miracle play out. One that honestly, if I get really honest in my heart, that I had kind of given up on as well, where there has been restoration in that relationship, and my dad is getting to enjoy a lot of healing in that place. And I'll call every once in a while. He'll be like, "Did you know such and such happened?" And I'm just like, I never imagined that they would restore that relationship between them. And so I share that more to say, like, I read this story a lot of times, and I think, like, this is how it works, right? Like, Jesus performs the miracle, bam, it's done, right? Like, Andrew, and it is how it works in the story. Andrew handed it over, and he instantly saw results. And the reality is, I don't think that's how it typically works for us. And I think a lot of times there's a lot of handing over because we tend to want to take it back when things get hard. But I just want to encourage you today to, like, keep handing it over. Don't give up. God has answered this prayer in ways that I wouldn't have ever dreamt up. So it might not be in the way that we expect it, but it might even be better than what we could dream up.